All right, greetings. Thank you, everyone. My name is Philip Hodge. I'm the Chief Strategic Development Officer here at GovQA, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's session. We're thrilled to have each of you attending, and on behalf of GovQA and our most strategic partner, Microsoft, we want to thank you for joining us today. We're excited for part one of a series of discussions around public records and cloud security, and I'll be guiding our conversation today. However, much of that dialogue will be from our two key guest speakers. First, my peer at GovQA and our Chief Operating Officer, Will Rapole, is with us. Will is one of the founders of GovQA, and if his name sounds familiar, you've probably heard him present at various public records or public safety events throughout the country. In addition to that, Will's been a key driving force behind a lot of our public records and product development here at GovQA. In addition to Will, we're happy to have participating with us Dennis Guzzi from Microsoft. Dennis is the Director of Intelligent Cloud Strategy on the state and local government team. And Dennis has spent almost 10 years in state government prior to joining Microsoft as the Integration Group Manager for the Office of the Attorney General in the state of Pennsylvania. Dennis has an extremely deep background in information and records management, along with the focus on security and compliance, and has spent his entire career working for or with government customers. So thank you again, Dennis, for joining. As I mentioned earlier, this is part one of a series of webinars discussing the pains governments experience around all types of information requests. We're focusing specifically on public records process today, but our following webinars with our friends at Microsoft will touch on other information request processes, including subpoenas, claims, and correspondence. A few housekeeping notes before we get going. First, we have almost 200 attendees for today's webinar. If you have any questions, please submit them via the text box on the GoToMeeting dashboard. Questions are indeed encouraged, so don't be shy. Secondly, we'll plan on sharing our information today along with the Q&A notes amongst this group. Finally, we'll follow up shortly after this presentation with a brief survey of the session. Please take the time to provide feedback, as the feedback you give us is going to help set future events and future subjects. Okay, let the games begin. So slaying the public request dragon. As my 9-year-old will tell me, or tell all of you, I am the king of bad dad jokes. So let's start with one of those. What's the difference between Game of Thrones and Twitter? Nobody actually has to answer, I'll tell you. Twitter has a limited number of characters. Heyo. So jokes aside, whether you're a fan of Game of Thrones or an innocent bystander watching as the series comes to end, the metaphor of the dragon as the public request response process should resonate well. In all of this, you are not alone, as you'll see throughout the next 45 minutes or so. Because this audience we're talking to today is a mix of key government titles, you know that there are ways to slay the dragon, and we're going to discuss a variety of those ways. Moving on, let's explore our dragons. Here's the good news. We can slay the dragons. Here's the bad news. There are actually 3 dragons. 1 second here, folks. Sorry about that. So more than riding the Game of Thrones tailwinds, there's a reason we called this webinar Slay the Records Request Dragon. The process of fulfilling requests for today's public organizations has simply become a beast. In the first part of this discussion, Dennis and Will are going to put some definition around this monster. As we all know, a problem defined is a problem half solved. So I mentioned there's not just one dragon, there are actually 3 dragons for us to deal with. Now, naming our dragons. Will, let's start with you. In your 20 years experience speaking with government agencies and doing research, what are the underlying causes of the public request process having become so unruly over the past few years?
Hi, everybody. This is Will Rapole. As Phil mentioned, I've been involved in government records and workflow processing for many years. And many of you might have heard me speak at various conferences on how technology can be applied to solving all aspects of request processing in government. As we all know, when the public records guidelines came to laws many years ago, it felt like a welcome change for the public. The basic function of all these public records acts is to ensure that our kingdoms, okay, get the whole Game of Thrones theme, meaning that federal agencies, states, cities, counties have informed subjects or residents, because transparency of government is truly vital to the functioning of a democratic society. The real interesting element is that as more of these processes and laws are put into place to supposedly help ensure this transparency, they only serve to drive the need for more complex workflows to review and determine things such as exceptions. It's like feeding a monster, but the more you feed them, the hungrier they become. And with the ever-growing volume of requests, especially from requesters outside of the general public, such as the media, different legal entities that you might deal with on an everyday basis, commercial companies and other government agencies, it's like a never-ending war. I like to tell people that there are really three different dragons that are associated with the public records battle. They are simply complexity, legislation, and litigation. Okay? Dragon number one deals with the complexity of the request itself and the breadth of information that's being requested. What we've seen is as public records requests become more commonplace, people are asking for just about anything. In some states, this forces the agency to actually perform work such as assembling data and not just producing the documents. Just the other day, I know an agency that talked to me that they received a request for all the code, for all the software that it uses, and they had no idea where to even start. The second dragon revolves around legislation. This constant state of evolving sets of compliance rules and exemptions requires an ongoing process and workflow adaptation by your agency. This also involves ongoing interpretations of these new laws and how they are to be applied. Examples of this are the latest laws in California and Colorado concerning the release of the police and internal investigative cases, as where there's multiple different ways that these new laws could be interpreted, and different lawsuits have ensued to understand how they actually are meant to be implemented. The third dragon involves everyone's favorite topic of litigation. Lawsuits are so pervasive in the space and typically revolve around two simple areas. Either the requester feels that the request was not complied with in a timely manner, or they question what was eventually provided.
Let's dive into that last point around litigation, Will. Thank you. That was great. But before we do that, let's start with the survey that many of you responded to. And the question was fairly straightforward. Has your organization been a part of any lawsuits related to your public records handling? And as you can see by the results, 31% of you said emphatically yes. And I would argue those of you that said no, be on the lookout, because that's not going to slow down anytime soon. So now's a good time to bring in our friend Dennis. Dennis, maybe you could comment from your experience at the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office. How did lawsuits play into the public record space?
Thanks for the chance to participate today. And I'm really excited about being able to talk today, because this topic is really, and technology like this is really near and dear to my heart. And that's because in my role at the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office, I and the team that I managed were responsible for the document and information management for the entire organization. This meant my team was responsible for production of documents and information related to litigation. And as such, I've had to testify in local and state and federal courts related to the production of information. So I've got a lot of deep personal experience in this space. And we dealt with this issue on a daily and weekly basis. And I've been party to hundreds of requests that I had to complete. There are two parts to this topic and, related to litigation that I think are relevant in from the experience that I can bring to the table. First, I often had to maintain and manage data in a regulatory compliant way. What I mean by that is in Pennsylvania, there were numerous requirements around the way data must be maintained and stored. Those requirements didn't change just because we were producing data related to a legal matter or public records request. The data and often the work process product used to produce that data could fall under those regulatory requirements. And it was those requirements, they included controls around things like access and accessibility and encryption for financial types of data, or personally identifiable information, et cetera. And because we were also a law enforcement agency, we also had to deal with something called sieges. So To that end, the second thing that I think that is relevant, and the thing that I wanted to make sure I mentioned as something that I think is pretty important to this conversation, uh, is that being able to meet the very strict security requirements being placed on state and local government customers. Now, I know in a few minutes you're going to talk about legislation as one of those dragons. And that's why I think when we talk about the need to continue to meet those regulatory requirements, but modernize our approach to the production of data, we need to think about the technology that these solutions are built on. And I wanted to mention that Microsoft has built the most secure, compliant platform for our government customers. Our ability to help our customers meet the complex regulatory standards while also providing rich security and controls make sure and ensures that those customers who are making those transformations that leverage cloud services are doing so in the most secure and compliant way possible. We have a cloud that meets CGIS, IRS 1075, HIPAA, NIST, FedRAMP, ITAR, and lots of other compliance designations. Using Azure allows our customers to be ahead of the compliance curve and head off those legal challenges related to meeting their regulatory requirements. And I know that was one of the things that I was most concerned about in that role, was making sure that I wasn't getting called back into court, or more importantly, the reason that the office got a fine, or more importantly, somebody was serving me with a summons that I was going to go to jail.
That's great, Dennis. It sounds like you've had a fair share of working to meet these regulatory requirements that everyone on this phone is dealing with related to public records. The sentiments Dennis echoed, we certainly here at GovQA. With that, I'll bring Will back in. Anything to add to that, Will?
Well, sure. I mean, there's no foolproof way to prevent lawsuits, right? But in many ways, we can actually help address the main areas that tend to trigger these lawsuits or potential lawsuits, right? So if you can start with compliance, just a simple way of effectively communicating with the requester is step one. Having automated ways to ask for clarification, help keep them up to date on the status is key. The rest is ensuring that, for complex requests that we'll talk about a little bit later, are in particular, that there's a plan that ensures the turnaround times are met. Lastly, effective communication with what was released or not released, okay, helps alleviate any conflict, right? So the requester actually understands that you're working through the process with them, you're effectively communicating with them, right? And there's no underlying current of we're not going to work on your request, right? The areas of privacy concerns requires the ability to help correctly identify and redact personal identifiable information, or PII as it's called, right? Or other information that's deemed an exemption under the law prior to the release. Once again, communicating why these were done to the requester is key, helping them to understand what was released and why. Okay. And then lastly, ensuring that your process is up to date with the latest rulings on any recent changes to the laws, right? Providing ways to ensure that your agency can effectively understand these, and having the ability to reach out to other entities, such as the state attorney general or other similar agencies for that opinion, is important. And that's what Dennis was talking about before. Okay? So.
That's great. Thank you, Will. Thank you again, Dennis. There's clearly a lot going on in this arena. And unfortunately, the number of lawsuits are only projected to increase over time. One of the common feedback noted with agencies using technologies to support the public records response is they actually find their compliance rates increase, which leads to avoiding some of these potential litigious situations or any pending lawsuits, let alone fines associated with them. So let's pause for a second. Let's take a minute to answer a question that has come in. And just a subtle reminder, we do have lots of questions flowing in, so that's great. I just do want to remind everyone, if you have a question, please submit it using the questions tab in your GoToWebinar dashboard. Will, I think this one is for you. In addition to the use of technology to increase PRR compliance, what other ways have you seen governments tackle this issue?
Well, Phil, I know that throughout our client base, we do see a lot of collaboration across agencies, city to city, city to county, even state agencies collaborating with the local county and city governments. They have their own monthly exchanges of information about the latest rulings and ideas, and just making sure that people are doing things in a compliant manner.
Okay, great. That's awesome. So clearly litigation is something that everyone in this call has to be mindful of and has to deal with. Much of this, though, really ties back to our second dragon, and that is complexity. Complexity is inherent in modern public records processing, which inspired our next survey question that you see in front of you. How many different departments are involved in your public records processing? 20% of you suggested that at least 21 different departments are involved in your public records processing. 83% of you indicated that multiple departments are involved in the processing and handling of public records. So, Will, we'll start with you again on this one. What have you seen in your experience over the past 20 years engaging different sizes of states, cities, and counties that drives this complexity?
Sure. So what we're seeing is there's three big trends that drive complexity today, right? The first is in regards to the request itself, and that's concerning the volume and breadth of the actual request. As the concept of public records have become more commonplace, with the general public, people are asking for everything under the sun, right? Anything they can think of, any question that comes to mind, they issue a public records request. So there's cities that handle well north of 50,000 requests, which in itself is a large effort. But when you combine this with the requests that are voluminous in nature, where they're asking for multiple things, they're asking the city to do work, this just presents a challenge in terms of ensuring that turnaround times are met. The second is the multi-departmental involvement. And this is based on the slide that we just showed, where many of you actually have 20, 30, 40 departments, that are involved in the everyday records process, right? And this is due to the effect of these complex and voluminous requests. The process in determining what departments are the custodian of what the records are, and ensuring that these are received with enough time to review and approve is just a challenge. Once again, this is where technology can kind of help provide a consistent process across all the different departments, so everyone understands what people are getting, when do they need to get it back to the public records coordinator, things like that. The third trend is the challenge of developing a consistent review process and determining any exemptions that apply. Due to the growing mix of source documents, with body cams and all these other different multimedia records that are so prevalent today, it's really becoming difficult for the centralized public records coordinators to be an expert in how they interpret all these different records that they're receiving in terms of determining their responsiveness and whether any exemptions should be taken.
That's great. Thanks, Will. I think it's appropriate to bring Dennis back in on this subject as well. Dennis, what would you add here?
Well, I have to say, of the three dragons, this is one of the ones that I battled most often. And for us, one of the biggest obstacles we faced when a request came in for production of information, that often we didn't know what we didn't know. And by that I mean it was often not possible to understand the nuances of every application that stored data in our agency. We couldn't be an expert at every system, but since often these requests were directed through IT, we wound up being responsible for making sure that we as the agency met every aspect of the request. So this led to a lot of what I often refer to as wait what moments. And what I mean by that is when we were reviewing the data produced and the methods used, I can't tell you how often someone would say, did you search this system or this source of data? And the inevitable response was, wait, what? Not even realizing that the data related to the request would be stored there or that the source of the data even existed. A quick example of this was a case in which the Commonwealth was being sued related to a law that was passed that actually itself added some regulatory requirements on internet service providers. The case was really complex. It had lawyers representing individuals, businesses, even interest groups. One of the requests to produce information was complex and required the production of documents, emails, notes, and even drawings. The day before I was required to testify about the volumes of information we had digitally and physically produced, one of the admin assistants who was assigned to the process was helping to validate the output and said, hey, I don't see document X and document Y. Now, I might be dating myself here, but she then said, when you did the searches, did you search the agent's zip drive? Wait, what? What zip drive? Now, the story has a happy ending. We were able to ensure we met all the requirements. But if not for someone mentioning an external drive that almost no one knew existed, that actually had original documents that lived nowhere else except that drive, I actually would have perjured myself the next day when I attested that all the sources were searched. And as is often the case, the question is, have you done the appropriate searches? Have you provided all the information? And when you say yes, they expect you to mean yes. So for me, simplifying the process and reducing complexity have become critical as more and more repositories for data have emerged, like cloud drives, thumb drives, the paper to digital modernization that a lot of government agencies are going through. So having a process that helped reduce that complexity would have been welcomed when I did this on a seemingly daily basis.
Thanks, Dennis. That was great. And I also appreciate you reminding me that there used to be a thing called an iOmega USB zip drive that used to fly off the shelf. So that's awesome. Unfortunately, here's the bad news. Like litigation, complexity is not going to go down anytime soon. Complexity is likely going to increase and continue to be a challenge associated for everyone here on the call. So I think it's appropriate now to move to our third dragon that we've called legislation. Legislation, again, not a surprise to most of you on the phone, is the third, in some ways, the biggest dragon, because the effect of legislation is sweeping in its nature. And it seems though every state is evaluating their records law, and that's on pretty good authority, because we at GovQA here actually track every state's legislative laws. So let's look at our third and our final survey question. Are you actively tracking any legislation in your state that will have impacts on your public records process? As you can see, almost 40% of you are, around 60% of you are not. In terms of best practice sharing, we strongly encourage staying attuned to what's happening with your state's public records laws and paying attention to what's happening in some of the larger states in the country. With that, Will, do you want to give us a few examples of legislation at the state level that's really been impacting our customers?
Sure. So as Phil said, at any one time, we're actively tracking hundreds of bills across the country. Each of these will have different varying impacts on the public records challenges or the dragons that we've been discussing today. Now, many of you know that some of these will never become law, but the trend is clear that public records processing is only going to get more complex, which is going to require more advanced technology solutions to help assist in the processing. These potential bills typically fall into a few camps, right? The first deals with additional exclusions, all right? Every time we pass a new law, there's more exclusions, there's more exemptions to what can be released, what can't be released, what circumstances it can be released. And this could be as simple as the legislature doing additional protections for themselves so that they're under less scrutiny. We see a lot of laws oriented in that. Or a very popular trend that we're seeing is the ever-increasing volume of multimedia content, especially in the area of public safety, with their increased usage of body cams and dash cams. This increases the challenge for the public records coordinator, as now they not only have to interpret requests based on the information that's being requested, but also who the requester is that's requesting the information. For instance, there's many laws that are being added that determine the processing guidelines based on the requester's actual connection to the data. Is this your accident report? Is this your attorney's asking for that accident report? Things along those lines. And for instance, all this does is determine what redactions are performed, how are they performed, what's the different exemptions taken, things like that. The second area actually deals with opening up areas of internal conduct reports that are to be released under public records. Previously, this was kind of a taboo subject, right? Those were never released, basically due to the fact that they contain a lot of personal information, a lot of private information. But there are several states that have addressed this topic in recent years. These tend to actually create their own challenges, that only exacerbate the issues we've already discussed due to that private and sensitive information that they may contain. Additionally, there's actually a very large challenge because much of this information became contained in paper files, right? Or older multimedia examples like the iOmega zip drive that Dennis just gave us, which basically creates issues in terms of how do you release these records in general, okay? So there's a couple examples in Colorado, in California, all around these internal investigations around conduct or police use of force, things along those lines. And then lastly, what we're seeing is many states are starting to actually gather information across their state to determine how well the actual agencies are just complying with the public records law. An example of this is in 2017, Washington passed a law which all larger agencies had to produce a compliance annual report card. For example, this increased the granularity in which the public records process needed to actually track things in terms of how the records were delivered, either electronically or via paper, right? How many people actually physically came in to review records, things along those lines. So basically just increasing what the public records coordinators have to track, how they have to process things like that.
Great, thank you, Will. And Dennis, I'm sure during your time at the Attorney General's office, legislation was a hot button. Did you see this drive more opinions that help drive legislation?
Absolutely. So in Pennsylvania, the Attorney General's office is both a legal and a law enforcement agency that has consumer, criminal, and civil law divisions. This meant that not only enforcing the laws that were on the books, but helping to drive the drafting or modernizing the laws that were being considered was part and parcel to what the office was responsible for. The office, while I was there, actually added lawyers and staff resources to each of those divisions whose sole purpose was to help drive and to impact existing law modernization and new legislation that was being passed. So what we found was, as technology continued to evolve, so was the drive to modernize the laws to support the change. But this also meant new and often time-challenging ways to meet the fast pace that sometimes happened with the changing legislation that didn't match the often slower pace of budget allocation to meet those challenges. So we had a lot of hurdles to jump through, and I know that still continue to happen today when these laws are passed and are in some cases modernized, but the budget and such doesn't align at the same time.
Thank you, Dennis. I got a kick out of your comments around the pace of legislation not matching the pace of budgeting. I'm sure everyone here on the phone can relate to that. So we have a question from the group. Question is, we are finding in Nevada that the correspondence among employees involved with strategizing and managing their request is very, very important to track the decision making that was made around what to release or what to not, who is involved with the decision making, etc. Are the speakers also finding this to be an issue that tools like GovQA can help with, not only compliance, but in the case of litigation, investigation by the legislator? So I'll start with Will on that one.
Sure. We can actually deal with this in a couple of different areas, right? So you're absolutely correct in that the concept of how to work these complex requests, especially across different departments, which is what we were talking about, is key, right? And some of the things that we actually do to deal with that is we actually provide several different features. One of them being a way to actually divide the request up into sub-requests or child requests. A lot of our larger agencies, a lot of our state agencies or larger cities and counties actually do this because back to the concept that we talked about where the actual custodian of record is the best person to determine what's responsive, how it should be redacted, things along those lines. And so basically what we do is we provide a way for you to actually divide the request up into, like I said, sub-requests. And all those are connected. So everyone can see who's working what portion of the request, when those things are due, how are those things connected, right? And then those all can actually come back at a single point so that you can see that. And then there can be an overview process by the legal team or things like that. There's also a lot of things that we do that are ad hoc in nature, where there's some at-mention functionality or other things where basically people can collaborate on that, even though they have those different sub-requests.
Great, thank you, Will. So we're going to move now, since we've covered all three dragons of the public records request process, reminder, litigation, complexity, and legislation, and we've gotten insight from Will and Dennis, a combined 30 plus years in this space, dealing with records requests and investigations. Many of you may be thinking, holy cow, what a bleak picture you've just painted. For those diehard Game of Thrones fans, just like episode 3 and episode 5 of this past week, you know, dragons breathe fire and they can cause a lot of destruction. And I think we've painted a picture of darkness. That's the bad news. The good news, what we're going to move now is to discuss now ways in which government agencies have slain that dragon, and they've seen an increase in transparency and compliance while reducing their response times. So the next couple of slides allow us to humbly brag about our customers. So please excuse the blatant pride we have in working with them, all along with a bit of commercial of GovQA and a little bit about us. So if you look at this map, what you'll see, many of our customers, where they are located, from different parts of the country, different states, different cities, different counties, different numbers of requests, almost all on Microsoft Azure. All the same objective: increase compliance while reducing workload in the public records request process. Many of these customers had the additional goal of doing the same thing for subpoenas, claims, and correspondence. We'll touch on that in a future slide here. And as we mentioned at the beginning, we'll have subsequent seminars on that. So now we're going to give you an overview of some of our customer accomplishments while slaying the dragon, then offer you a quick commercial about GovQA, which we hope begins to answer the question about why our customers choose us to help them accomplish their public request response goals. Here's a sampling of some of the results of our customers by the actual numbers. As a side note, these are all pulled from our website, so if you have any questions or want any information, you can certainly pull it from there. One of our customers, a city in the southern part of the United States with a population of 1.3 million, was experiencing approximately 45,000 requests per year, including 28,000 police requests. Because many of their processes were manual, like a lot of governments at one point, they would have to calculate the due date of each request received by hand. As of today, they have seen a 55% decrease in response time, along with the feeling that solution makes it easier for the requester, which is ultimately an important part of the equation. Another one of our customers is a county with almost 1.5 million people, and they saw an increase of requests annually by 673% because they were suddenly assigned all open records requests for their area. Even with that increase, they were able to reduce their ability to properly close out a request from an average of 24 days to 8 days. One of our state agencies in the Northeast handles 15,000 requests annually. The additional complexity there included 850 users in 27 different locations. With GovQA, they were able to reduce their processing time by 40% and track much, much more effectively. A quote from that customer: a process that took a whole day now takes 15 minutes. Finally, let's look at one of our customers that found themselves in the top 5 digital cities as ranked by GovTech. They reduced their processing times by 35% for their 1,000 total annual requests. Simply put, with their commitment in GovQA technology, they were able to execute against their mission. So the next couple of slides will transition into something we've mentioned a couple of times. Again, it's a good news, bad news scenario. The bad news is public records can be a dragon. The good news is we can help you slay it. The bad news, again, is public records are one of many urgent triggers or dragons that your business is dealing with. So whether or not you realize it, this is a sampling of what request workflow looks like in an organization. So you now have an opportunity to manage that internally a little bit better. But if you notice the bottom right, externally, many of these requests that you're dealing with are going to need to sent and deliberated with outside of your organization. So how can we help? So with the GovQA Exchange process, and let's use public records as an example, the request comes into the GovQA Exchange, we pull together all the relevant information, and again, we not only help you to satisfy that for public records dragons, but dragons around investigations, subpoenas, complaints, and correspondence. And folks, this isn't limited to these 5. These are the most frequent examples we see. And again, I just want to reiterate, as many of you on this call know, that handling requests internally are a big part of the equation, but on a go-forward basis, being able to handle those requests securely and with the compliance externally is going to be a key component to the equation. Part of what allows us to have confidence in sharing requests internally is our security difference. And really, I want to echo back to some of Dennis's first comments. The reason why we are such a strategic partner with Microsoft is their Azure government hosting is far and away the leader from a security and compliance perspective. If you layer that on to our single tenant architecture, our proprietary code base, and our commitment to meeting all compliance requirements, you have an equation for a lot of success. So with that, I thank you everyone again for the brief time to give you a GovQA commercial. If you haven't felt this thus far, we live, we breathe, and we know this stuff, and we have a great deal of passion towards it. I'm gonna turn it back over to our resident Dragon Slayer, that is Will Rapoli, who's gonna step us through some key components of the GovQA Exchange technology. So Will, back to you.
Sure, thanks, Phil. So I just wanted to basically have an opportunity to highlight some of the specific ways that GovQA by functionality can address some of these dragons that we actually have just talked about, okay? So the first way is that we actually provide proactive technologies via the web portal when people are trying to first search for public records, right? And the idea here is when an event happens inside of your city or your county or your state agency, you know, there's a shooting or there's some other newsworthy event, we all know that you're going to get public records requests, okay? And so we have many cities or counties and other clients that actually try to get out in front of these, okay? And so what this represents is, you know, Cleveland's an example of that, where they'll actually go and they'll preempt, they'll publish what they currently can publish, okay, during an investigation, for instance, okay? And this will be on the website, and we also use this in our deflection, which we'll talk about in a second, okay? But this is to basically get people, especially the media, used to the city or the county actually doing this type of proactive publishing. One of the big benefits here is that you also can follow this information, all right? Meaning you can subscribe. So as the investigation continues, let's just use that for an example, as you release more body cams or anything else, if they follow the actual proactive page, they'll get notified. They'll get a text message or they'll get an email saying, hey, this new information is out there. This is something that a lot of our clients actually, you know, work with the media on specifically, okay? You know, so it's a good way to just, like I said, proactively get out in front of any incident, trying to reduce the concept of duplicate requests, okay? Along the line of duplicate requests, when people actually go to the web portal of our clients, they also see different types of deflection that we use to reduce those duplicate requests, okay? What we're actually showing here is that when we actually make a request, there's several different deflections that are coming into play. We can actually search previously made requests and deflect the requester to those, okay? We can actually even search your website for existing content to say, hey, you've asked for something that's already existing. There's a page on the website. You should go here. We can even search some open data portals and things along those lines. And then lastly, we also search those proactive pages that you've already done, okay? All trying to reduce duplicate requests. Many of our customers, especially public safety agencies, the volume of duplicate requests are so large that these deflection technologies really do come into play for a lot of those reduction in processing times that Phil discussed for our case studies. The third way we actually address the complexity issue, okay, is along the lines of the question that was asked from Nevada, okay? People that have large agencies or even just distributed agencies in general, we actually have created this concept of a simple activity. And what this is this represents a way for different departments that maybe are never currently involved in a public records request for years to actually have someone go and ask them for records, okay? It's a very simple way. They don't actually have to log in. They'll get an email and they'll simply come to this 1, 2, 3 screen that you're seeing here, where they can upload the information, see what's being asked. And then, as Dennis spoke about, you'll see on the second image here, we actually track what they did, how long it took, but most importantly, what did you do? Where did you search? What did you find? Okay, did you actually not find responsive records? Well, tracking that and keeping that in the history log is important. Also knowing, what did you say that you searched? Did you actually search all the iOmega disk drives, right? Or do you actually search all the local drives, okay? Things like that are very important, but this 1, 2, 3 interface proves to be very useful for especially larger departments. So a few things about how we provide functionality that addresses the litigation dragon, okay, right? And the first is basically OCR technologies that we've incorporated into the tool, okay, to just ensure that even paper documents that are scanned actually have the ability to be searched for private personal identifiable information, or PII. And we incorporate this OCR process into the tool, into our redaction, to basically provide this feature. It's very useful, especially for some of these new request types that we talked about, where you actually have older documents, they're totally in paper, people are scanning thousands and thousands of pages, they might not have the OCR capability at the point of scanning, and so we provide that for you. Obviously, one of the big parts with litigation is making sure that you've effectively communicated with the requester. And a big part of this is making sure that they've gotten all your communications, okay? And so since, people can make requests on the web, but they can also drop paper off at the office, they can just shoot you an email, okay? We want to make sure that we actually have correct emails and communications back and forth with the requester. So we provide some very sophisticated email tracking that not only determines the delivery, did they receive everything? We actually track whether they opened requests, things along those lines. The second part for the litigation dragon is tracking all the things that are happening within the process. Once again, back to the question that came from Nevada, right? Tracking all the communications between the departments, understanding all that, tracking everything that's happening on the request on the staff side, but more importantly, tracking what's actually happening on the requester side, okay? This is back to making sure that we understand, was the requester, did they actually receive the information? Did they actually download the information? How many times did they download the information? I cannot tell you how many times our customers have shown and told us that this is incredibly useful, where they say, hey, I didn't get it. You guys claim you sent it, I didn't get it within the 10-day period. And they're like, well, let's see, you opened the email 4 times, you downloaded the document 5 times. I can see that you did that, okay, right? And so that's incredibly important. This whole concept of the audit log as well is very defensible, okay? So we do have different methods where this can be actually printed and taken to court, and so you see the whole history of everything should you actually have the litigation event occur. The first part of the legislation dragon is basically the concept of the configurability of the GovQA system to quickly adapt to some of these law changes. Many times there's very short time frames in which the law is passed and the law needs to be implemented. It could be as short as 30 days. So due to the configurations that we have within the tool, the ability to configure the fields and the workflows and things like that, we're able to actually implement some complicated workflow. And what you're seeing here is an example of that for California SB 1421, which is basically a new law that was passed around investigative use of force actions or administrative investigations for public safety agencies within the state of California, okay? Here, we actually have a couple different examples you can see on the screen, but this is an example of complicated workflows because these are all about past investigations, but they could be ongoing investigations where every so often I need to actually go and ask the detective, hey, can we actually go release this? Is it still under investigation? Is there anything new? Because we have to, under the law, effectively communicate with the requester. What's going on? When can they expect to have this? What are we taking exemptions on? Why are we taking exemptions, okay, throughout the entire process? So I just talked about exemptions, okay? And this is across the board where we actually provide 3 different types of exemptions for you to actually make sure that you're adhering to the public records law and back to having something that's completely defensible, all right? And there's 3 different types of exemptions that we'll track, and this is built into the tool. We track exemptions at the request level, okay? And so that could be for things for a full denial of the request, a partial denial of the request, whatever's necessary under the law. We also track document exemptions as well. So this way you can actually say, hey, you know, Phil's department actually provided us with said documents, but under the law, we did not provide those responsive documents to you for these reasons. And then lastly, when we actually do redactions within the tool, we actually produce a redaction log at the end of the actual PDF document that's produced. This redaction log has every single reason for every redaction within the actual document. So back to that effective communication with the requester, trying to show that, hey, we're being very transparent about what we did, how we did it. It's all actually shown here on the exemption logs. And then lastly, with reporting, as we mentioned, there's lots of different things that are coming out of legislation so that the states can kind of wrap their own arms around what's happening at the local level around public records. And here you actually see an example of what we did for the state of Washington. There are actual new reporting requirements that came out. And this is basically back to the configurability of the GovQA system, what we can track, how we can track. They actually have some pretty granular things around redactions, redaction logs, how many times each redaction reason was used, how many times each exemption was used, what was released, why was it released, okay? And those are all things that can be tracked within the actual application.
That's awesome. Thank you, Will. Everyone, if you haven't realized it, that's why we call Will our primary dragon slayer. It's with his expertise and skill around the area and our technology. That was awesome. So we do have one quick question relating to the product itself, Will. We're required to document how we produce the information that is being delivered in response to a request. Will this help me show what I searched and how to make that requirement easier to comply with?
Sure. So absolutely. So as we kind of just talked about the audit log, right? So every type of activity or any distributed event that we have where staff members actually going and looking for documents, they could be searching their email archive or anything along those lines, we're actually going to keep track of that, okay? And even if you have the more granular nature, like I talked about, where you actually have more complicated requests that require sub-requests, that's all going to be tracked as well at that level. So you'll actually be able to see everything. Like I said, an attorney can actually see what's going on. We even have the ability within our redaction tool to actually show the redacted text to a judge if you need to actually go. So you can print out the actual redaction where he can actually see the redacted text unhighlighted with the redaction reason, so it's defensible.
Oh, awesome. Got a bunch of questions coming in. We've got time for one more, and then I'd like to bring Dennis in for a couple of minutes for some final comments. We get several repeat requests where someone asks for the same things that either they've already asked for and want it refreshed, or they asked for the same thing someone else did. How does this help me address that? Will, you want to take that one too?
Sure, Phil. So when you actually have the duplicate requests, okay, as I showed in the deflection, there's a couple of different ways that we can handle that when the request is being physically made, okay? But what we actually see is a lot of times they will actually see an existing request and they'll say, oh, that fulfills my need, okay? What we also see though is back to that complexity that I spoke about earlier, where public records is so prevalent in the world that people just go ahead and ask for everything. Typically, you know, they might be upset, they might have heard a news article, and that's actually why they're reaching out. So one of the things that we also do is, even if it's not deflected on the portal side, it actually will be reflected and actually marked as a duplicate on the administration side. So the first thing that we do is every request that comes in, we actually search against all the existing requests as well, okay, within the tool. And that's not even just the public records. We also will search around subpoenas that came in or anything else, because we're actually trying to go ahead and mark all those as similar so they can be handled in a similar way. Any duplicates that we find can be marked and actually attached to each other. So you only have to upload the documents once, change any of the fields once, and they'll actually be all handled in the same way. So there's lots of things that we do on the duplicate for duplicate requests, whether it be on the portal side or be on the staff side.
Okay, great. Thank you, Will. So I don't know if we have time for any more questions. I did want to bring in Dennis one more time. Dennis, couple minutes, any closing thoughts from yourself or from the Microsoft team?
Well, first, again, thank you for everybody who attended the session today. And one of the things that I'll say, you know, first and foremost is I wish this product existed when I, worked at the Commonwealth of PA at the AG's office. The one thing that I think that I would really strongly encourage anybody who's attending, or even if they're going to watch the recorded webcast after the fact, is from a level of detail of what you saw today, just kind of scratches the surfaces of the capabilities that exist. And I would encourage you to take a few minutes and either reach out to your Microsoft team, or I know some contact information is going to be shared in a moment, to reach out to the GovQA team to schedule and see a more in-depth demo, and bring in additional resources from your teams, and really start talking about that deeper technical discussion, because what you saw today really is just that top layer. And once you actually get a chance to experience the product and see it working, and have that conversation with the GovQA team as well as the Microsoft team, if you're just considering cloud, if you're really not sure of what I was referencing earlier as it relates to Azure and some of the technology involved in that, reach out to your Microsoft resource, reach out to the folks at GovQA, and we can definitely help drive that additional education. And more importantly, the folks at GovQA will be happy to go to a much deeper level and show you some really cool additional capabilities inside the product.
Awesome. Thank you, Dennis. We're grateful for your time, Dennis. We're grateful for the partnership with Microsoft. So as Dennis mentioned, you'll get this contact information as well. Feel free to reach out to myself, to Will, to Dennis directly, and pretty easy for us to coordinate next steps. My hope is that those of you that are existing GovQA customers, first and foremost, thank you. We never take your business for granted, and hopefully we showed you a few things that you may not be taking advantage of today, but you might want to consider moving forward. Those of you that are not GovQA customers and are interested in a follow-up conversation, please, please, please don't hesitate to reach out. We can make that as formal, informal as you'd like to see. So again, as a reminder, we very much can help you slay the public records dragon. There are also other dragons that all of you are dealing with. The next webinar will start going down the path of how do we slay some of these other dragons. So with that, we'll end the session. I want to thank everyone again for their time and their questions, and we look forward to a future conversation. Have a great day, everyone.